The phone rang 4 times before it stopped. May Whitmore did not move from the chair by the window. She looked at the phone on the table beside her, watched Richard's name glow on the screen, and let it ring. Outside, the parking lot of Pinewood Care Center held the same flat gray light it held every Tuesday morning, the same cracked pavement, the same tired cars, the same front door her son had walked through 6 weeks earlier, carrying only 2 bags of her life. The phone stopped. Then it rang again. May reached over, picked it up, and turned it face down on the table. Beside it sat a small framed photograph, the one she had brought with her when Richard and Sandra packed her things and told her this place was practical. Practical meant the cheapest room they could find. Practical meant $12 a day above what Medicare covered. Richard had mentioned that number twice, the way people mention numbers when they want cruelty to sound like math. May picked up the photograph and looked at it. No expression. No performance. Only the stillness of a woman who had decided long ago that her face belonged to her, and she would choose what it showed. She had spent 31 years building something. Not loudly. Not in a way that needed applause. In early mornings before anyone else woke. In careful columns inside a worn savings ledger. In small decisions repeated for so long they became invisible, which was exactly what she had intended. 2 miles away in the house where May had lived for 31 years, Richard and Sandra were standing in front of a black steel safe. It was not small. It was not decorative. It had been bolted to the wall in 1997 by a man May hired, paid in cash, and thanked by name. Richard knew the safe existed. Sandra knew the safe existed. Carol had seen it once when she was young and had never asked about it again. None of them knew the code. May could picture them clearly, Richard with one hand on the dial, Sandra behind him with her arms crossed, Carol standing near the doorway, already understanding that something about this was wrong. They would try birthdays. They would try anniversaries. They would try the last 4 digits of May's phone number. Nothing would work. The phone lit up again. Richard's name. May looked at the photograph in her hand, then set it gently back on the table. Outside, a woman helped an older man out of a car and walked with him slowly toward the entrance. May watched them go. The phone stopped ringing. The safe would not open, and the only person who knew the code was sitting in a $12 a day room at Pinewood Care Center on a Tuesday morning in November with a photograph on the table, a phone face down beside it, and all the time in the world. May was waiting for them to ask nicely. The smallest possible smile crossed her face. Then it was gone. The phone rang at 7:14. May looked at it. Richard's name on the screen, the letters familiar and without surprise. She watched it ring the way you watch something you have already made a decision about, without urgency, without the internal debate that precedes an unmade decision. The phone rang 4 times and stopped, and the room was quiet again. May turned back to the window. The parking lot of Pinewood Care Center held the early morning light in the flat way of paved surfaces that have nothing to catch it, with no angles or textures, just the pale November gray reflecting back at itself. A maintenance man was moving along the far edge with a leaf blower, the sound of it distant and without intrusion. May watched him work the leaves toward the gutter in a slow, methodical arc, and thought without sentiment that he was good at his job. The room was small. She had known it would be small when Richard described it, had heard the dimensions in the way you hear numbers when someone is using them to make a decision feel inevitable. She had not argued. She had looked at the window and thought about the light and decided the light would be adequate. She had made it hers in the ways available to her. The photograph on the nightstand in its plain frame, the worn notebook beside it, the cover soft with handling the spine cracked in the particular way of something that has been opened many thousands of times. The blue ceramic mug she had brought from the kitchen on Sycamore Street, the one with the chip on the handle, that she had always meant to throw away and never had, which now seemed correct. A small plant on the windowsill, a pothos, because pothos survived anything, and she had always respected that about them. She dressed slowly and without hurry, which was not the same as slowly with difficulty. She dressed the way a woman dresses when she has decided that the beginning of the day deserves attention, each thing done in its order, each thing done completely before the next. She had kept this habit for 74 years, and she saw no reason to revise it because the room was smaller. Helen arrived at 7:45 with the breakfast tray, which she set on the small table by the window with the practiced ease of someone who has delivered thousands of trays and has not yet lost the habit of treating each one as though it matters. Helen was 58 and had worked the second floor of Pinewood for 11 years and had in May's assessment the quality most important in a person, which was that she paid attention without making you feel observed. She noticed the photograph on the nightstand. She had noticed it every morning for 6 weeks, but this was the first morning she said anything. She said, "That's a good frame. Simple." May said the frame was an afterthought. The photograph was the point. Helen looked at it for a moment. She said, "Who is it?" May smiled. She picked up her mug and looked out at the parking lot and said, "Someone who knew me when I was worth knowing." Helen waited to see if there was more. There was not more. She collected the empty juice cup from the previous evening and moved toward the door and paused. She said, "You have visitors coming Thursday, May." May said, "I know. I've been expecting them." Helen looked at her for a moment with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say something further. She decided against it and went out and the room was quiet. May ate her breakfast without rushing. The eggs were adequate. The toast was slightly overdone in the way of institutional toast that has been made in quantity and held, and she ate it without complaint because adequate food eaten in peace was preferable to excellent food, eaten in the presence of people who wanted something from her. The phone rang again at 8:30, Richard's name. She reached over and set it face down on the nightstand beside the photograph and left it there. She opened the small drawer in the nightstand. She looked at what was inside. She did not take anything out. She looked at the contents for a moment with the same quality of attention she brought to everything complete and unhurried, and then she closed the drawer and sat back in her chair. Outside, the maintenance man had finished with the leaves. The parking lot was clear. The November light had shifted slightly from pale gray to something warmer, the particular quality of late morning light that arrived on clear days and lasted an hour before flattening again. May picked up the photograph. She held it in both hands. She had not spoken to Richard in 11 days. 11 days of phone calls set face down. 11 days of the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who both know what the conversation will contain and are for different reasons not yet ready to have it. Somehow that felt like the most honest thing left between them. May held the photograph and looked out at the parking lot and waited for Thursday with the patience of a woman who has spent 31 years understanding that the right moment was worth whatever it cost to reach it. May touched the wall of her nursing home room. The paint was smooth and institutional, the particular texture of walls that have been repainted many times over many years until the surface has lost whatever character the original plaster had and become simply a neutral presence. She had touched this wall every morning for 6 weeks, a brief contact, her palm flat against the surface for a moment before she moved on with her day. She did not examine the habit. She simply did it. The gesture was familiar. She had done it in the house on Sycamore Street for 40 years in the front hallway, the plaster there uneven and cool under her hand, the particular texture of walls that had been made, when walls were made differently and had retained the evidence of that making. She had touched it every morning. She had not known she did it until it was gone. The family meeting had been 3 months before the move. May had been in the kitchen when Richard and Sandra arrived. She had heard their car in the driveway, had heard the doors close in the particular sequence of two people who have been married long enough that their movements are synchronized without discussion, and she had continued drying the dishes because the dishes needed drying, and because there was no useful action available to her that would change what she already understood was coming. She had heard them in the living room before she went in. Sandra's voice practical and clear, the voice she used when she had already decided something and was sharing the conclusion. The costs were not sustainable long term. The house required maintenance that was realistically beyond what May could manage alone. There were excellent facilities, genuinely excellent, that provided exactly the kind of support that made sense at this stage. Richard's voice lower, the voice of a man listening and agreeing and adding the occasional specific that made the agreement sound like participation rather than compliance. The one on Millbrook was supposed to be good. His colleague's mother was there. She seemed settled. May finished the dishes. She folded the dish towel over the oven handle the way she had folded it for 40 years and walked into the living room. Carol was on the sofa. She looked up when May came in with the expression she had been wearing for several weeks, the expression of someone carrying something they have not found a way to set down. She did not speak. May looked at her for a moment and then looked at Richard. Richard explained. He was thorough and he was kind in the way of someone who has prepared his kindness in advance, who has organized it alongside the practicalities so that the two arrived together and could not be easily separated. The house was too large. The upkeep was genuine. Pinewood Care Center was the most sensible option given everything: a clean facility, adequately staffed, Medicare supplemented so the family contribution was manageable. He slid the brochure across the dining table. May picked it up. She read it without expression, the way she read everything that required reading from the beginning, and without skipping. The photograph on the cover showed a woman about her age sitting in a sunlit room with a plant on the windowsill. The woman in the photograph was smiling at something outside the frame. May set the brochure down. She asked what will happen to the house. Richard said, "We'll take care of it." May looked at him. He was 49 years old, and she knew his face as well as she knew any face in the world, had held it in her hands, when it was 3 days old, had watched it become the face it was now, through all the intermediate versions. She knew looking at him that "we'll take care of it" was the complete answer he intended to give. She said, "I've always been comfortable, Richard. That was never the problem." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and returned to the logistics, which were considerable, and provided sufficient material to fill the rest of the meeting without returning to the question she had asked. Carol looked at her hands. The night before the move, May went to the basement alone. She went after dinner after Richard and Sandra had gone back to their house, and Carol had offered to stay and been told it was not necessary after the house had settled into the quiet of its last full night of being hers. She went down the basement stairs without turning on the overhead light, using the small flashlight she had kept on the shelf at the bottom of the stairs for 30 years, because the overhead switch was in an inconvenient position, and she had never gotten around to having it moved. The safe was against the back wall where it had been since 1997. She crossed to it and stood in front of it and put her hand on the dial. She turned it. Right, left, right. The handle moved. The door opened. She stood for a moment looking at the contents. Then she reached in and took something small and put it in the pocket of her housecoat. She closed the door. She spun the dial. She stood in the dark basement with her hand on the safe for a moment, and then she turned and went back upstairs. Moving day was a Thursday. October, the trees on Sycamore Street in their full color, the maples in particular doing what they did in October, which was to be unreasonably beautiful, in a way that seemed almost effortful. May carried one bag to Richard's car, one small bag the same size she would have taken for a long weekend, which she had decided was the right size for what she was willing to carry forward. She went back inside for the last time and stood in the front hallway and put her hand flat against the plaster wall. She held it there for a moment. Then she took the house key from her keychain and placed it on the kitchen counter. She looked at the counter. She looked at the key. She picked up her coat and walked out and did not look back. Not because she was not affected, but because she had decided sometime in the previous weeks that 40 years deserved more than a backward glance and less than a performance, and the only thing that met both criteria was simply to leave. Richard locked the front door behind her. He had not noticed that the key she left was the house key. He had not noticed that the key she did not leave was the one she had been carrying for 26 years on a chain around her neck, the one she had taken from the safe the night before and placed in the pocket of her housecoat and transferred on the morning of the move to the pocket of her good coat, where it had rested against her side on the drive to Pinewood and in the weeks since. She had given them everything they asked for. Everything except one thing, and they had not even noticed it was missing. Richard had been in the basement for 40 minutes. He had started with the obvious combinations. May's birthday, February 14th, 1950, his father's birthday, the year they bought the house, the year his parents married. He had worked through them methodically, each combination tried twice in case he had misaligned the dial on the first attempt, and each one had produced the same result, which was nothing. He had called a locksmith at 9:15. The locksmith had given him a number that assumed the safe was a standard residential model, and then revised the number upward when Richard described the make and the age and the installation, and the revised number was high enough that Richard had said he would call back and had not called back. He stood in the basement with the flashlight aimed at the dial and thought about the insurance documents that were, according to the estate attorney's letter, required to be produced by the end of the month. The letter had arrived 10 days ago. Richard had assumed the documents would be in the file cabinet, which they were not, and then in the desk drawers, which they were not, and then in the fireproof box in the closet, which contained other documents but not the specific ones required. The safe was the last place they could be. He called his mother at 9:47. He used the voice he used when he needed something and was aware that needing something required a particular approach. Warm but not effusive, concerned but not alarmed, the voice of a son calling his mother on an ordinary morning to check in, which happened to coincide with a question he had. May answered on the third ring. She said, "Hello, Richard." He said, "Mom, hi. How are you feeling? How's the room? Is Helen still on your floor?" May said yes. Helen was still on her floor. The room was the same as it had been. She was feeling fine. Richard said that was good. That was really good to hear. He said he had been meaning to call. He said things had been busy, the usual work, and the house there was always something. May said yes, there always is. He talked for 4 minutes. May listened without interrupting. She did not ask questions or offer the conversational assistance that made it easier for people to talk, the small affirmations and prompts that kept the other person moving forward. She simply held the phone and listened and let Richard's voice fill the space it was going to fill on its own. When he arrived at the safe, he came at it sideways, the way he came at things he was uncertain about, describing the insurance situation first, and the attorney's letter and the deadline and the documents that seemed to be nowhere else in the house. He said he thought they might be in the safe. He said he was trying to locate the combination. He said, "Do you happen to remember it?" May said, "Why do you need it, Richard?" He explained again more specifically, this time the insurance documents and the estate requirement, the deadline at the end of the month. He said it was just a practical matter, nothing complicated. He just needed to get in there and find the papers. May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come visit me, Richard. Bring Carol." Richard said, "What?" May said, "Come to Pinewood, Thursday or Friday, whichever works. Bring your sister." Richard said, "Mom, I appreciate that. I'd love to come see you, but the deadline on these documents is actually pretty soon, so if you could just tell me the combination, I can get into the safe and find what I need, and then we can absolutely plan a visit." May said, "I know about deadlines, Richard. I managed paperwork for 31 years. Come visit me. Bring Carol." A pause. Richard said, "Why Carol?" May said, "Because some conversations should have witnesses." The line was quiet for a moment. Richard said, "What does that mean?" May said, "It means come Thursday, both of you. I'll be in the common room." She said it the way she said things she intended to be final, without edge, and without elaboration, the tone of a woman who has made a decision and is communicating it rather than proposing it. Richard said, "Okay, Thursday." He said it with the slightly flattened quality of a man who had expected to get what he needed from the call and had not gotten it and was recalculating. May recognized the quality. She had recognized it in his voice since he was 14 years old. She said, "I'll see you then. Tell Carol I'm looking forward to it." She ended the call. She heard him reporting back to Sandra before she had fully set the phone down, his voice carrying the specific flatness it carried when he was delivering news that Sandra was not going to receive well. She could not hear Sandra's exact words through the phone, but she did not need to. She had known Sandra for 22 years, and she knew the shape of Sandra's impatience, which was precise and immediate and directed at whatever was in its way. May set the phone on the nightstand. She sat in her chair and looked at the parking lot for a moment. A delivery truck was backing in along the service entrance, the beeping of its reverse alarm steady and mechanical and oddly peaceful. She opened the small drawer in the nightstand. A corner of folded paper was visible at the back behind the Bible and the reading glasses and the small things that accumulate in nightstand drawers without being placed there deliberately. She looked at it for a moment. She had not asked her children to come in 3 months. Now she had. She closed the drawer and looked at the parking lot and felt in the quiet of her $12 a day room something that was not excitement and not relief, but was adjacent to both. Readiness. She had chosen this moment very carefully. And Thursday was 2 days away. Thursday arrived cold and clear, the kind of November morning that had no ambiguity about its intentions. Richard and Sandra reached Pinewood Care Center at 10:15, which was 15 minutes later than Richard had said they would arrive, and they came in through the main entrance with the particular quality of people entering a place they have not been before and are forming opinions about before they have fully cleared the doorway. The facility was smaller than they had imagined. The lobby was clean, but the floors were the worn linoleum of a building that had been adequately maintained rather than recently renovated, and the lighting was institutional in the way of places where lighting is functional rather than considered. A television in the corner of the waiting area was showing a morning program at low volume. 2 residents sat near the window in the chairs positioned there for the purpose. Richard and Sandra stood in the lobby and said nothing about any of this. In the hallway leading to the second floor, Richard said something to Sandra in a low voice, and Sandra responded in the compressed tone she used when she disagreed with something and was choosing to register the disagreement quietly rather than fully. Richard's jaw moved slightly. Then they walked toward the elevator without further discussion. Helen was at the nursing station when they came off the elevator. She looked at them with the attentive neutrality of someone who has been told a great deal about a situation without having been told any of it directly. She said, "You must be Richard. And you must be here about May." Richard said yes, they were here to visit his mother. Helen said, "She's been expecting you." She said it simply without inflection and turned back to the chart she had been reviewing. Richard looked at her for a moment and then looked at Sandra, and then they walked down the hall toward room 9. May's door was open. She had arranged 2 chairs across from her own, angled slightly toward each other in the way of chairs in a room where a specific conversation is expected. On the small table between them was a pot of tea and 2 cups that Helen had helped her prepare that morning, a detail May had arranged without explaining why she wanted it. The photograph was on the nightstand. The notebook was closed. May was dressed in her blue blouse, the nicer one, and she was sitting in her chair with her hands in her lap and her posture completely straight. She was the host. Richard came in first. He said "Mom" and crossed to her and bent and kissed her cheek, and May received this with the same quality of attention she gave everything present and without performance. Sandra said "Margaret, hello," and sat in one of the arranged chairs, and placed her bag on her knees in the way of someone who has decided not to commit fully to a room. May poured the tea. She poured Richard's first and then Sandra's and then her own, and she did this without hurrying, without the slight acceleration that anxiety produces in habitual gestures. She handed each cup across the small table and settled back in her chair. Richard asked about the room, about Helen, about the food, whether it was decent, whether she was sleeping all right. He asked these questions with the warmth he had prepared for the call 3 days ago and brought with him today, carefully maintained, and May answered each one briefly and accurately and without the elaboration that would have made the conversation comfortable. Sandra watched this exchange with the expression of someone waiting for the relevant portion of a meeting to begin. After several minutes, Richard said, "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about the house, about the safe specifically." He said they had been going through the paperwork, and there were some documents the estate attorney needed that seemed to be in there, and if she could just give him the combination, he could get everything sorted out. May looked at him. She said, "What documents specifically?" Richard said, "Insurance records, some property documents, that kind of thing." May said, "Which insurance, the home policy or the others?" Richard said the home policy mainly. May said, "That's filed in the green folder in the second drawer of the kitchen desk. It's been there for 11 years. A brief silence. Richard said, "We may have looked in the wrong place. There might be other things in the safe that the attorney needs." May said, "What other things?" Richard's answers became vaguer. He spoke about the estate process, about the attorney's requirements, about the general need to have a complete picture of the estate's assets. He used the word comprehensive twice. Sandra shifted in her chair. Sandra said, "We just need the number, Margaret. It's not a complicated request." May turned and looked at Sandra. She looked at her with the complete, unhurried attention of a woman who has decided exactly how much of her looking to give to a particular person and is giving that precise amount, no more and no less. She held the look for a moment that was slightly longer than comfortable. Sandra stopped talking. May turned back to Richard. She said, "When did you last sleep well, Richard?" Richard blinked. He said, "What?" May said, "You look tired. You've looked tired since you came in. I'm asking when you last slept well." Richard said he was fine. He was a little stressed. There was a lot going on with the estate. May nodded. She picked up her tea and held it in both hands and looked at him with the same quality of attention she had given everything in this room, complete and without hurry. She said, "I'll think about it." Richard's composure showed the first crack. It was small, a slight tightening around the eyes, the expression of a man who had arrived expecting a transaction and is understanding that the transaction is not available on the terms he brought. He said, "Mom, the deadline is the end of the month." May said, "I understand deadlines, Richard." She said it gently, not unkindly, with the tone of a woman reminding someone of something they already know. They stayed another 20 minutes. The conversation moved to other things, the surface things that fill time when the central thing has been set aside, and May participated in these with the same quality of measured presence she had brought to everything. When they stood to leave, she thanked them for coming. She told Richard to drive carefully. She did not look at Sandra when she said goodbye. She watched from her window as they crossed the parking lot. She saw the shape of their conversation before they reached the car, Sandra's posture and Richard's hands, and the compressed argument of two people who had agreed on the outcome before they arrived, and have returned without it. She watched Richard's car leave the lot. Then she picked up the photograph from the nightstand. She held it at a slight angle, and the light from the window caught the surface of it, and for a moment the image was almost visible. A young woman, a man beside her, the corner of a house behind them, a front porch, the edge of something that might have been a garden. May looked at it for a long time. She had given them nothing today, and somehow she had learned everything she needed to know. Helen found May at the small table by the window with the notebook open in front of her. She had come in to check on the morning medications and had stopped in the doorway when she saw May's posture, which was different from her usual posture, more inward, the posture of someone reading rather than waiting. The notebook was worn, the cover soft and slightly concave from being carried and handled over many years, the spine reinforced with a strip of tape that had gone yellow with age. Helen said, "Is that a diary?" May looked up. She said, "More like a record." Helen set the medication cup on the table and looked at the notebook, and then looked at May with the genuine curiosity she brought to the things that interested her, which were different from the things she was required to be interested in. She said, "What kind of record?" May said, "Sit down, Helen, if you have a minute." Helen had a minute. She had learned in 11 years on the second floor that the minutes you made for people were usually the ones that mattered, and the other ones passed without leaving anything behind. She pulled the second chair closer and sat. May turned the notebook so Helen could see the page. The columns were precise, each entry in May's handwriting, which was small and consistent. The handwriting of a woman who had learned early that legibility was a form of respect for the person who would read what you wrote. Date on the left, amount in the second column, a brief notation in the third, and on the right, a running total carried forward from page to page in the careful way of someone who understands that accuracy is not optional when the numbers are real. The first entry was dated March 1992. Helen looked at the page. She looked at the date, and then at the amount, which was $43, and at the notation beside it, which read, "Household Surplus March." She looked at the running total at the bottom of the visible page, which was a number considerably larger than $43. May said, "I started when Richard was in his second year of college. Harold had been gone 3 years by then. I was working at the county assessor's office, and I was doing alterations on the side, taking in clothes from the neighborhood. Every month I put something away." Helen said, "For how long?" May said, "Every month for 31 years. Even when there was almost nothing left, I put something away." Helen said, "For what?" May was quiet for a moment. She looked at the notebook. She turned back several pages to an entry in 1997 and placed her finger beside it. She said in September of 1997, Richard's car needed an engine. It was going to cost more than he had. I had been saving for a trip. Harold and I had talked about going to the coast before he died. I had been putting money aside for it since 1993. I took that money and I gave it to Richard for the car. She looked at the entry. $1,140, 4 years of putting away what I could. Helen looked at the entry. $1,140, 1997. The notation read, R's car engine. September. May said I never told him where the money came from. I said I had some savings. She turned the page forward. The following month's entry was $12. December of that year was $31. The amounts climbed back slowly, month by month, across the following year. Helen watched her turn the pages. She said, Did you ever take the trip? May said Harold was gone by then. She said it without self-pity, as a fact, the way she said most things. I kept saving anyway. She paused. It became its own reason after a while. It wasn't about the trip anymore. Helen looked at the notebook, at the columns running across page after page, the handwriting consistent through the decades, the same deliberate precision from 1992 to the final entries near the back of the book. She was doing the arithmetic in the way you do arithmetic when the numbers are in front of you, and your mind does it before you decide to. And the arithmetic was arriving at a number that was different from what she had expected. She said, May, what is the total? May turned to the last page with entries. The running total was in the lower right corner, carried forward from the previous page, written in the same ink as the rest. Helen looked at it. She looked at May. May said, That's not counting what's in the accounts. That's just the ledger. What I kept track of to remember how it was done. Helen said, Does your family know about this? May said they know about the house. They know about the savings account in the usual sense of knowing something, which is that they know it exists without knowing what it contains. She closed the notebook. She placed it on the table beside the photograph, the two objects side by side, the worn cover of the ledger and the plain frame of the photograph, both of them, the same quiet weight. She looked at them together for a moment. She said, It's all in there, everything I did, everything I am. Helen looked at the two objects on the table. She looked at the woman sitting across from her, at the hands that had written every entry in that notebook, at the posture that had not changed since Helen had known her, straight and unhurried and entirely present. She said, Does your son know about this? May looked at her. She said he will. The room was quiet. Outside, a car pulled into the parking lot, the sound of it arriving and then stopping, an ordinary sound on an ordinary Thursday. Helen looked at the ledger. She had worked the second floor for 11 years, and she had known many people in these rooms, and she understood, sitting at May's small table, with the November light coming in through the parking lot window, that she was in the presence of something she did not have complete words for. Not wealth, or not only wealth. Something that had been built the way certain things are built, not from a single decision, but from 31 years of small decisions made consistently in the same direction in the early mornings and the late evenings and the months when $12 was what was left, and she had put it away anyway. May had not kept the ledger to prove anything. She had kept it because someone had to remember. And she had been the only one who was going to do it. Carol arrived on a Saturday morning without calling ahead. May heard her in the hallway before she appeared in the doorway, the particular sound of someone moving slowly and without the purposeful stride of a person who is certain of their welcome. She appeared in the frame of the open door holding flowers, the kind sold in the buckets near the register at gas stations, slightly wilted at the edges, the cellophane wrapping still on them. She was holding them the way you hold something you know is inadequate and have brought anyway because you needed to bring something. May looked at her. Carol said I should have called. May said, Come in, Carol. Not warmly, not coldly. The way you open a door that you have decided to open with the full intention of opening it and no more than that. Carol came in, and May took the flowers from her and put them in the water glass on the windowsill, and they stood there with their stems in the water looking like what they were, which was an apology in the form of flowers. Which was not enough and which both women understood was not enough. Carol sat in the chair closest to the door, which May noticed the unconscious positioning of someone who has not entirely decided to stay. She tried to apologize. She began twice and stopped twice and began a third time and got further before stopping the halting, inadequate sentences of a woman who has been rehearsing something and has discovered that the rehearsal did not prepare her for the room. She said she should have said something at the meeting. She said she hadn't known how. She said she thought it would be better, and she had been wrong, and she had been telling herself it was fine for months when it was not fine. And she was sorry. May listened without interrupting. She let Carol's words arrive and settle the way you let something settle when you have been waiting for it long enough that the arrival itself is a kind of resolution regardless of the form it takes. When Carol stopped speaking, May did not rush to fill the silence. She let it sit between them for a moment, not cruelly, just honestly, the way silence sits when it is doing something rather than simply being empty. Then May reached to the nightstand and picked up the photograph. She held it for a moment. Then she turned it so Carol could see it. The photograph showed two people standing in front of a house. The house was the one on Sycamore Street, visible in its younger version, the front porch, with the railing that Harold had painted white, and the garden that was just beginning the rose cutting visible as a small stake in the turned earth near the front walk. The woman was May, younger than Carol had ever known her, standing very straight with her hand through the arm of the man beside her. The man was Harold, young and solid-looking, not at the camera, but at May, his expression the expression of someone who has found the place he intends to stay. Carol looked at the photograph for a long time. May said that was taken in the spring of 1978. Harold had just planted the first rose cutting. He was 32 years old. I was 31. Carol said, "You look so happy." May said we were. She paused. We were also very broke, which you can't see in the photograph. Harold was working 2 jobs. I was working at the assessor's office and taking in alterations. We ate a lot of rice that year. She looked at the photograph. But he planted the roses. He said we needed something that would outlast us. Carol looked at the photograph and then at May and then back at the photograph. May said I worked for 31 years after Harold died. Not because I had to after a while, because it was what I knew how to do. I saved what I could. I gave what was needed. She set the photograph on the table between them. I didn't ask for anything back. I thought that was the right way to do it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you ever ask me what I wanted?" Carol looked at her. May said it again, not louder, not with emphasis, just with the repetition of someone who wants to make sure the question has been fully heard. "Did you ever ask me what I wanted, Carol?" Carol did not answer. She looked at her hands, and May watched her receive the question, watched her follow it back through the years, the way you follow something when you have been handed the right end of it. Back through the nursing home meeting and the brochure sliding across the table and the months before that and the years before that, back through all the Sunday calls and the holiday visits and the times May had been asked how she was and had said fine. And Carol had accepted fine because fine was easier to accept than the real answer. Carol's eyes filled. May did not move toward her. She did not reach out or offer the comfort that would have made the moment smaller. She let the tears come, and she let the silence hold them. Because the silence was not empty. It was the weight of 43 years of a question that had not been asked, and that weight deserved its full measure of time. After a while, Carol wiped her eyes. May reached across and took her hand. Her hand was steady. Carol's was trembling slightly, the trembling of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally set it down. May said, "I'm not angry, Carol. I'm tired." "There's a difference." Carol said, "What are you going to do?" May looked at the photograph on the table, at Harold looking at her in 1978 in front of the house where the roses were just beginning, at the young woman standing beside him who had worked and saved and given and kept a ledger for 31 years because someone had to remember how it was done. She said what I should have done sooner. Carol looked at her. May squeezed her hand once and released it and sat back in her chair and looked out at the parking lot in the November light. Carol had come in trying to fix something. She left understanding that some things did not need fixing. They needed witnessing. And May had been waiting a long time for someone who was finally ready to see. May was at the small desk at 7 in the morning. She had moved the desk chair to face the window the previous evening, a small adjustment, and the morning light came in across the surface of the desk at the angle she had wanted. The ledger was on the left. The photograph was on the right. The phone was in the center. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and looked at the 3 objects arranged in front of her. Then she picked up the phone and dialed. The number was not in her contacts. She had memorized it years ago the way she memorized things she considered important, which was carefully and once, and she dialed it from memory without hesitation. It rang twice. A man's voice answered. Not the receptionist, not an assistant. The man himself, which told her he had been expecting the call or had arranged to take it directly, which she had suspected he would do. She said, "James, it's Margaret." He said, "Margaret, I've been wondering when you'd call." His voice was the voice she remembered from the meetings years ago, measured and precise and without the false warmth that lawyers sometimes used when they wanted you to feel comfortable before they told you something difficult. She had always appreciated that about him. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said, and he had been doing so for 37 years of practice. She said, "I think it's time." He said, "Are you sure, Margaret?" She said, "I've never been more sure of anything." A brief pause. Then he said, "I'll need a few things from you." His tone had shifted to the efficient register of a man beginning a task he has been prepared to begin for some time. She listened and answered and gave him what he needed, specific information in a specific order, her voice the clearest and most direct it had been in the 6 weeks she had been at Pinewood. She spoke for 9 minutes. She gave him instructions without elaboration, each one complete, each one following the previous with the logic of something that had been thought through fully before it was spoken. At one point he asked a clarifying question and she answered it precisely, and he said "good," and made a note she could hear through the line. At the end, he said he would have everything in order by the following morning, and she said that was exactly right and thanked him. She ended the call. 2 miles away, Richard was on the phone with Pinewood's front desk, his 3rd call of the morning. May could not hear him, but she knew the shape of it, the carefully controlled impatience of a man trying to reach his mother through institutional channels and being told correctly that she was unavailable. He had called yesterday evening and been told the same thing. He would call again this afternoon. May wrote something on a small piece of paper. She wrote slowly and without hesitation, the way she wrote everything that mattered. She folded it once. She placed it inside an envelope, the plain white kind, and sealed the flap. She wrote a name on the outside. She set the envelope on the desk. Then she went to the doorway and said Helen's name. Helen appeared from the nursing station at the end of the hall. She came in and looked at May, and then at the desk, and then at May again. May held out the envelope. She said, "Keep this for me, not in my room, in the nursing station." Helen took it. She turned it over in her hands, looked at the name on the front, looked at May. She said, "Should I be worried?" May said no, relieved. Helen looked at her for a moment with the attentive quality she brought to things she was taking seriously. Then she said okay and folded the envelope once and put it in the pocket of her scrubs and went back out to the hall. May stood at the desk. She picked up the photograph from the right side of the desk and looked at it. Harold looking at her in 1978 in front of the house where the roses were just beginning his expression, the expression of a man who has found the place he intends to stay. She had kept it face down on the nightstand since she arrived at Pinewood, a habit she had not examined, something between privacy and protection, keeping Harold turned away from the room that was not the room where he belonged. She crossed to the windowsill. She set the photograph down face up. Harold looked at her from 1978 in the November light of the parking lot window, and May stood for a moment and let him. Then she sat down in the chair by the window and put her hands in her lap and looked out at the parking lot. Richard would call again this afternoon. Tomorrow morning James would have everything prepared. By tomorrow evening the shape of things would be different from what it was today, different in the specific and irreversible way that legal instruments make things different, which was quietly and finally, and without the need for anyone's raised voice. She had spent 40 years being patient. She could afford to wait one more day. Richard arrived at 9 in the morning. He came alone. May had known he would come alone, had known it since Carol left on Saturday, with the particular look of a woman who had said something to her brother before she made the drive, something that had shifted the shape of what he was carrying. He appeared in the doorway of room 9 without Sandra, and without the prepared warmth he had brought on Thursday, and without the controlled impatience of the phone calls. He looked smaller somehow, which was not a physical fact, but an accurate one. He had not slept. She could see it in the way he held himself, the slight collapse of a man whose certainty had been providing structural support and has begun to give. He said, "Mom." May said, "Sit down, Richard." He sat in the chair across from her, the same chair he had sat in on Thursday, and he put his hands on his knees and looked at her with the expression of a man who has come without a plan for the first time in a long time and is not entirely sure what to do with the absence of one. May looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'll give you the code." Richard looked up. The surprise was genuine, she could see that. And behind the surprise, the small, involuntary movement of a man towards something he had been trying to reach, and then behind that, almost immediately, the suspicion. The thing that had made him his father's son and his own man simultaneously, the practical intelligence that asked what the catch was before it accepted the gift. He said, "You will..." May said, "Yes, but first I want you to read something." She reached to the desk and picked up the ledger and held it out to him, open to page 12. She had opened it to that page that morning, had found it without looking the way you find pages in a book you have handled for 30 years. Richard took it. He looked at the page. Page 12 covered the years 1994 and 1995, the columns in a May's small, consistent hand, each entry dated and notated and totaled. He read slowly, which she had expected, the slowness of someone who is not sure yet what they are reading. His eyes moved down the column of amounts, the modest numbers of those years, the careful accumulation of what was left after the bills and the groceries and the ordinary costs of a woman living alone with 2 children in college. Near the bottom of the page was an entry dated October 1994. The amount was $980. The notation read, "Our tuition shortfall, October, covered from Coast Fund." Below it, the following month, the running total had dropped by $980, and the rebuilding had begun again, $20 and $30 and $40 at a time, the slow, patient reconstruction of something that had been given away. Richard read it. He read the entries around it, the context of it, the months before when the Coast Fund total had been climbing, and the months after when it had begun again from a lower place. His expression moved through the stages May had expected it to move through, not quickly, but completely. Confusion, first reading without full comprehension. Then recognition, the arithmetic of it landing, understanding what Coast Fund meant, and what the $980 had been taken from, and what it had been given to. Then something that was not quite shame, but was in the same country as shame, the expression of a man arriving at a knowledge he would have to carry from this point forward without being able to set it down. He did not speak. May said, "I started that fund the year after your father died. We had talked about going to the Oregon coast. We never went." She looked at the window. "I kept saving for it anyway. By 1994, I had enough. And then your tuition came up short in October, and I used it." Richard looked at the page. May said, "I never told you where the money came from." There were other entries like it. Sandra's car, 2003. Your sister's medical bill, 2009. The Christmas you called and said you were short. I don't say this to make you feel guilty, Richard. I say it so you understand what the ledger is. She reached over and turned to the last page with entries. She set the ledger on the table between them and let him see the running total in the lower right corner. The number she had shown Helen the previous week, the number that had shifted Helen's expression in the way it was now shifting Richard's. She said, "That's not the whole of it. The safe has the account records, the full picture. That's what you've been trying to reach." Richard looked at the number. He looked at his mother. He said, "Mom, I didn't know." May said, "I know you didn't, Richard. That was always the saddest part." She said it gently, without the edge that the words might have carried, without the weight of accusation. She said it as a fact, which it was the saddest part of a long story that had other parts, 2 better parts, and this was only one of them. She reached to the desk and picked up the small piece of paper she had written on the previous morning. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at it. 4 numbers written in her handwriting, clear and legible. He did not stand up to leave. He sat with the paper in his hands and the ledger open on the table between them and the November light coming through the window, and he looked at the piece of paper the way you look at something that has cost more than you understood before you received it. After a while, he said, I should have asked. Before any of it, I should have asked what you wanted. May looked at him. He was 49 years old, and she had known his face since before he had one, and she could see in it at this moment the boy who had loved her, before he had learned to take her for granted, which was not a thing that made the taking for granted acceptable, but was a thing that made it comprehensible. She said, yes, you should have. She did not say it was all right. She did not offer him the comfort of an easy resolution. She said, yes, you should have. And she let it be what it was, which was true, and she let him sit with it because some things required sitting with. He left 20 minutes later. He stood at the door and looked at her and started to say something, and then did not say it, which was its own kind of honesty, and she received it as such. She said, drive carefully, Richard. He went. Helen came in with tea at 10 o'clock, the good tea, the kind she kept at the nursing station for particular mornings. She set it on the table and looked at May, and did not ask how it had gone, because the room had the quality that answered the question without requiring words. May wrapped both hands around the cup. She sat for a while in the quiet of the room, in the November light, in the $12-a-day room that had been hers for 6 weeks, and that she had made into the place where the story resolved itself. She thought about Harold in 1978, planting a rose cutting in the turned earth and saying, give it 40 years. She thought about 31 years of columns in a worn ledger and $980 given away in October 1994 and the slow, patient rebuilding that had followed. She thought about Carol's hand trembling in hers on Saturday, and Richard's face when he read page 12 and the attorney's calm, efficient voice on the phone 2 mornings ago. She picked up the photograph. She looked at it for a long moment. Harold looking at her in 1978, his expression the expression of a man who has found the place he intends to stay. She set it on the windowsill, face up, in the full morning light. She had never raised her voice. She had never made a scene. She had built something for 31 years in the early mornings and the late evenings and the months when there was almost nothing left. And she had put something away anyway, and she had outlasted them, and in doing so she had won everything that mattered. Not the house, not the number in the ledger, not the code written on a small piece of paper now in her son's hand. The knowing that she had always been exactly what she was, and that no one's failure to see it had made it less true. The photograph sat in the light. May drank her tea.